I am the daughter of a child refugee who arrived in the United Kingdom on the Kinder transport. And of course, many child refugees from Nazi Germany and Austria were not so lucky, and many adults were not so lucky. So I exist because of the kindness of strangers, and human rights are essential to my view of the world. The fact that we are all born equal. We all like to talk about the fact that we're born equal, but how do we ensure that we are all treated equally? And for me, human rights is the answer to that question. If we're all equal, then we must all be treated equally, and human rights are the way of ensuring that every one of us's dignity and basic needs and rights are met.
So, starting with the first question, human rights are a way of describing the universal character of humanity. At present, many people don't relate to this. Fear, division, and lack of knowledge get in the way. Why do you think that is?
Unfortunately, we have forgotten what we learnt from the rubble and the legacy of the Second World War, that all of us are vulnerable, that none of us can really trust that the future is certain and that our rights are certain. And a narrative and an ideology has taken hold that somehow protecting rights is an infringement on our liberty, that we, in order to be truly free, need to be free of restrictions on how we behave, that somehow speaking up for human rights is woke or left wing or not something that benefits everyone, something that is of one side of the political spectrum. And that's incredibly damaging, because what it does is it erases what we know to be true and what your great grandfather knew to be true, which is that if we don't provide protections to our fundamental rights, they can be ridden over and terrible things can emerge as a result. And I think we also focus very much on our freedom too, our freedom to do whatever we want in, our advanced, ultra neoliberal agenda where individualism really is prized above the collective and the common good. We have this idea that we shouldn't be tied down, that we should be free to do everything, but we forget about the other side of freedom, which is the freedom from oppression, the freedom from torture, the freedom from extreme poverty and instability. Those freedoms matter just as much as our freedom to act. And in fact, for large swathes of the population, there is no freedom unless freedom from is enshrined, as well as the freedom to. So I think that what's been forgotten is that there, but by the grace of God go we. Any one of us could be tomorrow's victim of human rights abuses, but when we have power, we feel invincible and we somehow think we're better, and we mistake our fortune for merit, whereas in fact it's through grace and luck, and an accident of birth, often where we're born, often determines whether we have human rights that are fully functioning or not. It's not something intrinsic to any of us.
Can you offer some immediate and practical steps to help people recognize their own human rights, respect the rights of others, and to understand that human rights are, in fact, universal?
Part of the problem with how we talk about human rights is that it feels as if they are somewhere else and that doesn't apply to our normal everyday lives. But in fact, human rights are about how we all live. It's about our dignity, it's about respect, it's about how we're spoken to, it's about equity, it's about justice. So I think we have to make human rights really granular and relevant. And when I speak about human rights, I will talk about, do you want your daughter to be able to do the same kind of jobs as your son? Do you want to make sure that your granny can't be restrained against her will when she's absolutely fine? So I try and humanize and bring it down to the granular detail of how we all live, because all of us as humans have a really strong innate sense of justice and fairness of what's right and what's wrong. But we often forget that that's what human rights is about. It's about justice, it's about fairness, it's about equality. So, how can we bring that down to how we all live? And when we think about people we love and what we want for them, it's often much easier to make human rights feel real than when there's some abstract notion that applies in some far off country where terrible things are happening, because terrible things can happen anywhere.
Our understanding of human rights adapts to the condition of the world at any time. How would you describe the evolution of human rights over the past 75 years?
Human rights, sorry, I'm just going to, you might have to edit this. Let me just think for a moment. The idea that never again would we see the atrocities that happened in the Second World War gave birth to what we now call human rights. But unfortunately, since their birth, we have seen atrocities across the world, not at the level that we saw in the Second World War, but we've seen pockets of absolutely terrible violations and abuses of human rights. So the first thing to say is that we're not there yet. We have enshrined them. And the second thing is to say that they need to evolve because new threats are emerging. Climate poses an absolutely enormous threat to how we all live. The fact that many millions and millions of people are going to find themselves living in places that are no longer habitable, that we're going to have mass migration, that we're going to have even more issues around scarcity of resources and how we can all survive on the diminishing resources of a planet in peril. That's a situation where the opportunity for abuses are going to be many. And so we really have to make sure that people understand what human rights are and adapt them to this situation. And we're also seeing new ways of conducting warfare, new ways of creating breaches of human rights, whether they're violence online driven by, dark forces on the internet. We need to have human rights that apply in the digital age and the climate crisis age, and in an age where we're increasingly all connected, and yet many of us remain unable to defend ourselves and exercise those basic rights.
What can we learn from the pioneers of modern human rights after the Second World War?
What your great grandfather and others taught us was that there are certain inalienable rights that need to be absolute. And one thing that concerns me is that we are seeing a shaving away of this. We're seeing a willingness to look again at what should and shouldn't be considered a human right for political expediency. We're seeing those on the far right who claim that human rights abuses are responsible for bad immigration decisions or other domestic decisions, being willing to concede that yes, we may have to look at this, or we may have to make amendments, and we may have to modernize. But the thing about human rights is that they're absolute. They're absolute, and they pertain to each of us as individuals. They're not relative. And so I'm particularly concerned that we have forgotten or are willing to take risks with what the pioneers of human rights understood were really, really essential and non-negotiable. And I think the other thing that we're forgetting is again what those pioneers knew, which was that the abuse of human rights doesn't start with violence. It starts with dehumanizing. It starts with othering. It starts with categorizing people as being different from other people, so that the idea of universality begins to become unhooked. And somehow, if people aren't the same as us, we don't need to accord them the same rights to dignity. So I think right now at this moment, on this incredible anniversary year, we are seeing the increasing use, certainly amongst politicians and those who dominate online, of dehumanizing language. That is a precursor to human rights violations, and we all need to be really concerned.
What would be your principal objectives for a programme to educate future generations in human rights?
I love this. If each of us could really understand the dignity of being human, then it would be much easier for us to defend these rights and treat others as respect. So I think that learning about human rights, and I think it's essential that we learn this in the classroom, begins with the dignity of all humans, that all humans have the same needs, the same wants, that we have so much in common that it's easy to forget. But of course, the problem is that in any classroom, you will have a group of children whose human rights have already been abused. You will have children from backgrounds where they have adverse childhood experiences, where they will have grown up in an environment where violence or abuse or unkind and cruel actions are the norm. And that's why it's even more important that the classroom teaches each of us what we're entitled to, so that even if we're not getting it in our home initially and then in our workplace or our community or our family system afterwards, we understand what is and isn't okay. Because if we don't understand what is and isn't okay for us, it's going to be much harder for us to row over and have that empathetic connection with someone else who is being treated badly. So I think there's a lot of psychology in the teaching of human rights, about what wholeness is, about what authenticity is, about what it is to be fully human, because we talk a lot about the right side of human rights, but what about the human side of human rights? What about the things that wound us that maybe we can't legislate for, but which then go on to begin a process and a cycle of abuse? So I think we need to teach our children much more about psychological wellness, about what happens when people are triggered into fight or flight or freeze or fawn, those very responses that we see in authoritarian regimes, so that we understand them in our own bodies and our own psyches, and then we're better able to each become an advocate for the rights of others.
Could we do more to secure human rights? What is the single most important thing that could be done to ensure human rights are secured?
The first thing I would say is that no government should talk about amending human rights or somehow softening them. But what we do need to do and make sure that we have proper systems in place. For example, the reason why the far right have been able to mobilize against human rights using illegal immigration, for example, is because we don't have efficient systems to deal with immigration. We don't have fair systems, we don't have fast systems, we don't have proper safe routes for those who are fleeing persecution to come. We have to look at our language, how we talk about those who are fleeing persecution. Do we speak about them as invaders or people who have no right to be here, or do we talk about them as humans who are fighting for their lives? So I think the language we use, the way we categorize people, whether we have just and equitable systems in place within our own countries, matters a lot. But I think the main thing to recognize is that all of us are the same, irrespective of what we have or don't have, irrespective of what education we may or may not have, what status we may not or may not have, what ethnic origin, what gender, what sexual orientation. We are all the same and we are all equally worthy, and we must all have the same rights. And that commonality is probably the most important, fundamental to us as humans, not just in protecting our rights, but also in how we live and connect with each other.